So this is our second Skil Saw Pro Tip video. First one's been out, I don't know, 4 years now, 5 maybe. It's one of the first videos we did. And as in that Skil Saw Pro Tip video, I'm going to beseech you to go back and watch the startup, the Skil Saw Basics video, if you haven't operated Skil Saws before, because these things are first, productive, and second, lethally dangerous. And what I'm going to show you in this video, just like what I showed you in the other Skil Saw Pro Tip video, is and are in fact pro tips. And just because you can pick up a saw and pull the trigger does not mean you should try some of what I'm about to show you. The first key to not getting hurt by a Skil Saw is to grab it with all the strength that you've got, whatever your strength is. And whatever kind of saw you've got, whether it's a worm drive, one of these inline beauties, or a sidewinder on the left or on the right, whichever it is, you've got to grab that like it's trying to get away from you. Because if you're holding it like it's trying to get away from you, when it tries to get away from you, you're going to be ready. And besides that, a locked wrist is the way to cut a straight line. If your wrist is not locked, it's easy for the saw to sort of be undirected. If your wrist is locked, it's harder to get your saw out of line because your whole arm has to deflect from your course. Can you see that? If your wrist is slack, it's easy enough to let your saw wander, in a short distance, because it's only your wrist and your hand action that's restraining it. But if you make your forearm right from the trigger finger to your elbow one solid chunk, now it's sort of the sighting radius on a pistol, right? When you have a longer sighting radius, you get more accuracy than when you have a shorter sighting radius. Lock your wrist to get a longer sighting radius on your Skil Saw. There's another concept here, and that was sort of a demonstration, but unlike a jigsaw or a reciprocating saw, a sawzall or a jigsaw proper, where the slower you go, the more accurate you can make the intricate turns and bends and cutting what you're cutting with a jigsaw, you go slow and easy and let the blade kind of pull its way through the work instead of forcing the blade into the work for an accurate cut. In general, once you learn to use a Skil Saw, a faster cut tends to be a straighter cut. Think of it. If you're going slow and you're uncertain and you're trying to stay on the line, you're usually going to be on the line when you cross it. But if, on the other hand, you move at a good rate, lock your wrist, keep moving, and then when you see yourself beginning to get off, get back on gradually instead of suddenly. Overall, it's going to be a straighter cut. I spent some time in that previous video talking about gang cutting, sort of different ways to establish a square line and cut on across a board. I don't think that I really talked about the fact that a Skil Saw, a worm drive Skil Saw, is a drop saw. It is not at its maximum capacity. If you line it up at the edge of the board, sight where the blade is going to make contact with your line, pull the trigger, and come on across. I mean, you can do that. It's intuitive, it works, but a Skil Saw works best, and your cuts will be better if you start your cut from a slightly, like about maybe 30-degree elevated position. You hook the guard on the edge of the blade, you pull the trigger. Now this is a violation of every possible safety rule because you're bringing a moving blade into contact with a stationary object. It wants to eat your lunch, but it also gives you a chance to establish the line of your cut into the line that is on the board before you are committed to that trajectory and your saw is binding in order to straighten it up, like this. I don't know if you can see, but at that point, the saw is established on the line, and it will carry itself on the line all the way across, rather than starting at the edge and finding the appropriate path. You've got the appropriate path, and that board's not cut off yet. Then the saw drops down to the horizontal position. Now that may sort of strike you as being a meaningless distinction, and I mean, what possible good can it be? But I will tell you that if you think of a Skil saw as a worm drive Skil saw as a drop saw, okay, let me back up and address the concerns of the linguists. Circular saw, worm drive circular saw. You know what, boys? If my nose is running, I ask for a Kleenex, and when I pick up one of these, I ask for a Skil saw. So I've said it before, you will undoubtedly hear me say it again, but as wonderful a tool as a rufus or a speed square or a tri-square or a framing square or any other kind of a square is, you don't need to be getting it out all the time, any more than you don't have to get your tape measure out all the time either. Every time you can bypass using your tape, you're making money, or somebody is. Every time you can cut a square line without getting out a square, you are establishing yourself as a very efficient carpenter, Larry Hahn's term. Larry was a fan of this. He would tell us, learn to see square. What that means is that you can teach your eye to automatically see a 90-degree angle and recognize if it's significantly different than 90 degrees. That corresponds nicely to the fact that a worm drive Skil saw is a drop saw. It's really hard to see, visualize a 90-degree cut, start on the edge and push across at 90 degrees. It's really easy to visualize a 90-degree cut and then drop your saw onto that line you're visualizing. Can you see that at that point right there, the blade has established its path, unless you change it, and that you can sight by the corner of the table and see a beautiful 90-degree cut, which you know is doing exactly the same thing with the blade. And you drop it in and push it across. Nothing wrong with that. Okay, that's a square cut. And I didn't have to pull out my square to get it. Learn to use a Skil saw as a drop saw. I don't know what the statistics are on this, but I am going to pretend that I do and tell you that most Skil saw injuries happen because of A, cutting out of position, or B, not understanding how gravity is going to cause a kickback. Now ideally, this is the safest position for using a Skil saw. At a bench, at horses. You're controlled, you've got the center of gravity where it needs to be, you got a good grip, 2 hands if you want, not a bad policy. But there are times in framing where you have to cut in anything except a safe position. Now the first and most obvious out of position cutting that everybody does and everybody criticizes is cutting across your instep or across your knee. You don't always have sawhorses, you're out on the deck, you got to make a cut, bam, you cut down here. It has become an industry standard risk. You keep it away from your foot. Your foot is providing an opportunity for gravity to help the block you're cutting off drop off. Now when you come up higher, the risk is even greater because if it kicks back, it doesn't get into your other shin or into your toe, it gets into your femoral artery and you pump it out right there on the deck. So you start cutting over your knee, close to your waist, close to your thighs. Don't do it. Find a way to do it another way. Now fascia board cutters. There are times when you've got to cut over your head, and the sawdust is raining down and you're operating the trigger with your little finger instead of your index finger. Desperate times, desperate measures. But man, you've got to pay attention to your balance and where you're standing and what's happening with the guard. By the way, however dangerous it is to hold or block the guard up like this, it's way more dangerous to do this. But sometimes you got to do it. So sheathing or sheeting, depending on who you are and where you're at and what you like to call this stuff, is any kind of a sheet good. And right now I've got 2 remnant pieces of 1/2-inch plywood, which is a pretty good representation of what is often used for sheeting roofs. 1/2 inch, 5/8, depends, most of the time that's the thickness. And there's sort of a whole set of Skil saw moves and cuts that can be made to really speed up and make better sheeting a roof. So on a roof, this would be fine. If that's centered on the truss or the rafter, There's room to get nails or staples right into the piece so it's sweet. That's good enough. But if this is on the deck of a floor and it needs to be tight for appearance or for any other reason, or maybe decking on the substrate under a countertop or something, and you want a better cut, here's a good way to do that. I'm going to set the saw to depth so I don't hurt my expensive 2x6s anymore. And understanding that in some places this fits nice and in some places it fits terribly, I just cut both sheets at the same time again. Now in one particular place, the gap was bigger than the saw kerf. So I push it together, clamp it, do it one more time. Now you can do that again. You can put a straight edge on there and do that so that you don't have that randomness. But on the other hand, that's really darn good for roof sheeting. Plenty good for a floor deck, minus the expansion requirement. But the idea is that you are cutting both pieces at the same time. Any deviation from straight is accounted for in the cut on the other piece, and it'll close right up. So let's imagine that this represents a little bit of a roof system. And these are the top chords on 3 trusses or rafters, right? I mean, and we're walking on those or we're decking them, and we've got sort of a random layout. The stacker's got the layout wrong, or we're coming up to a dormer sticking out of the roof, and so our 24-inch layout has been interrupted. We're coming from the left, and it doesn't hit on the stud, on the truss. Well, we throw one sheet down, and we nail it. We're not afraid, because we've got a trick. It's nailed down, but it's not nailed on the truss where you want it to break. But you've got a mark where you want it to break. So there is the center of the truss. And you throw the other sheet down. And let's say that can't hit on the layout either. It's butting up against something else. And so you're just kind of fouled. You got 2 sheets that have got to be cut. And so you either call the measurements down to your trusty ground man who's sitting down there patiently waiting for something to do, or you drop both sheets, get the long axis of the sheet where you want them, put a couple nails in the second one, and then you snap a line right over the top of both sheets down the center of your truss. Remember, you've got 2 sheets that have to be cut, but you don't have much time. And your ground man took a break anyway. You got nobody helping you. Bam. So now you know that line is the center of your truss that's down there 1 inch. You set your depth a little extra deep because this plywood's warped. About like yay. And then you cut both sheets with one pass. And you throw that to the ground, and you shake the sheet a little bit. That'll drop off a roof. We had the screw on that. But there's your cut, okay? 2 sheets cut, 1 pass, really no measurements. That is a way to get way ahead of the guys across the street that are trying to keep up with you on your roof sheeting agreement. Now there's another thing that a Skil saw will do for you at this particular moment. and it'll get that sawdust off there. You don't have a broom, you don't have a leaf blower, you don't have a nozzle to put on the end of your hose on your stapler or your nail gun, but you got your trusty worm drive. Now that's not just handy to sort of satisfy our OCD tendencies. It'll save your life, because that sawdust is a lubricant and it's a set of ball bearings, and it will send you to the ground, and your Skil saw will clean it off. So I don't feel like cutting up a full sheet of plywood to demonstrate these things. So I want you to imagine that I've got a 4x8 laying here, and I've got 2 feet of it nailed down where it needs to go, and 6 feet of it's hanging out there, or 5 feet, or some amount that it's heavy, right? And so it's got to be cut on that snap line. I don't know if you can see that, but I've got a chalk line, and the sheet's got to be cut, and it's a long ways to the ground, and you don't want to drop it, and how do I control it? Or maybe it's just hanging off the end of your workbench. Here's how you cut across a wide sheet, maybe wider than you can reach, and still maintain control of the process. You don't start where you want to start. You start in about a foot. You drop it in. And then you just run your cut out to the edge. And now this last bit, which is going to free the piece and let gravity do its good work, can be controlled. You can hang on to the edge, you're in position, you got your center of gravity back over where you're going to live through it, and you cut it off. You see that? That works on floor diaphragms, it works on decks on countertops, it works anywhere you've got to cut sheeting and gravity's going to tear a piece off and you're not ready to catch it. Cut the far side first, get back and cut the near easy part second. So maybe you're building in the American Southwest where arches are still in style, lazy arches and passageways and maybe on front elevations on houses. So you can cut an arc with a Skil saw. You do not just have to cut a straight line if you can. So, you know, we'll talk sometime about laying out and striking arcs, but we're going to strike, I don't know, some portion, maybe what, 30% of the circumference of a circle with a 5-foot diameter here, something like that. That's kind of a lazy arch. So you can go out, you can go get your jigsaw, you know, you can do that. There's nothing wrong with that. You could almost hack that out with a Sawzall. There may be something wrong with that. That's pretty rough. Or you can hack it out with a Skil saw, and if you're careful and use one of 2 techniques, you can get it close enough to wrap so the drywall guy can get a nice tight bead around the corner, or the stucco guy can make it look good. Now don't misunderstand me. This is not for furniture work, it's not for trim work, it's for framing when you got to get the work done and you ran out of time a day ago. So there's a couple of things. You can cut an arc by using a progressively deeper cut. Start shallow, so less of the blade is inside the wood, and so it will cut a curve. And then inside, can you smell the smoke? It's a little smoky in here right now. And then in the space that's been created by the kerf and the wobble and the struggle of the blade to make that crooked cut, you set it just a little deeper. In this case, we're going to get full depth on the 1/2-inch plywood in 2 passes. So the 1/2-inch plywood is perhaps not the greatest to demonstrate with, because I could have set that 1/2 inch deep and just forced it. It would have been a tougher cut, we would have had a lot more howling and complaining, but it would have ended up with about the same product. If this was a thicker piece of wood, if it was 1.5 inches or certainly 3/4, that makes the progressive cut works better, but it may be that you just plunge short, straight segments. Now you can do that and leave a nice, relatively smooth curve on the positive side of the shape. If it's the negative side of the shape that you're hanging on to, It's going to be a little rough, but if you're careful, you can make it very, very usable in what you have to accomplish. And if you cut it from the back, the side that presents can be real respectable, like this. So the positive shape is nice, and it would be nice on a piece of 3/4 or almost anything else. The negative shape is a little bit hacked, but let's look at the back side of it and see if it's any better. So it's not an excuse, it's a fact. Skil saws are made for rough work. And for rough work, any of this is useful depending on what it is that you're trying to accomplish and who it is you're trying to impress. For a carpenter, a shim is an indispensable tool. And frankly, we don't often enough think of a shim and all of the good it can do. We don't always have a packet of door shims from the hardware store in our truck, and sometimes those door shims are too petite. Can I say they're just too light for what we've got to do? Sometimes you got to make shims. Now you can pick up a board. Let me do that. Let me show you the least desirable way to make a shim. You can try to get a safe position, you can try to protect your fingers, or you can just take a chance. And on a wide board, you can hold it and cut your way on across for a little while. But you can always just kind of throw up a board, cut it off, and there's a shim, and you can get another one off the other side. There's two. But then you begin the dicey prospect of cutting into the interior of the board. Yeah, it's not a huge deal. But if you've got to make a few shims, I like to do it like this. I like to C-square, make a drop cut, and true up the end of the board. If I need to, although you almost never have to be this fussy, if you want your shims to be the same length, I don't even know why you would, but let's say you want them to all be about the same length. That's a waste of time. But the idea is, you just start cutting. The first ones off the end are easy. Now we begin to leave the small end where you're working. It begins to become necessary to roll the guard up out of the way. I had one shim drop out, that's fine. Sometimes those narrow ends will get pulled up between the blade and the guard and it bogs the saw down. But there's a set of shims. You just come around the end. And cut them off. Not rocket science, but it's nice to be able to do it. So I've got one more sheeting trick to show you back here in the back corner of the shop. But before I do that, and before we wrap this video up completely, I've got to reiterate a couple things. A lot of what you've watched me do here today is not recommended. If you're not strong, if you don't know how to run a Skil saw, don't try a lot of this stuff. It may get you thrown off of some jobs, but it'll make you money, okay? So just saying, it's a continual cost, benefit, risk and reward analysis, right? As grown-ups, we all have to make those. As employees, we all have to follow the instructions and the policies that our employer puts down for us. But I'll tell you what, however risky a Skil saw is, however dangerous and likely and hungry it may be to eat your lunch, the modern world could not have been built without them. And in many cases, a successful career as a carpenter can't be built without it either. Watch this last move. Do you know what a botch is? A botch is a noun. A botch is what you do. It is the item that you use to cover up a mistake. So I'm just about to install a botch right here. This hole was cut so I could put my boat winch against this jamb in order to lift that handcart up and down as needed. Bad design, I changed it. So now I need to cover this hole up. That's what I'm going to do next. My first move is to take a piece of plywood, about the same color. Now, as I've already shown you and talked about, if I just cut these lines, that piece is going to drop right in there even if the cut isn't straight, and there will be a gap the thickness of the kerf, the sawdust that comes out with the cut. But if I bevel my Skil saw just a little bit, I'm going to guess maybe, let's see here, 5 degrees. You bevel it 5 degrees, make the rip. When the piece goes into the hole, the edge will have grown enough to cover the seam, we hope. This is a theoretical move. We're going to set the depth with some extra. We're going to set this to about 5 degrees. We're going to visually inspect what it looks like. Then I turn the bevel over on the top side and cross my fingers. So this is a good example of out of position cutting. Pulling the trigger with the little finger, paying attention. So I'm not sure that went very smoothly, but we got it done. And it is a better installation than would have been done if I just would have chopped it out square and, put it up there. It's certainly better than had I tried to square an opening and square a piece and put it in. You just can't get that really right in a reasonable amount of time. So this is the third video that we've done on the Skil saw, in use, ideas and procedures and warnings. Let me reiterate that the warnings are important. And if I've missed anything, and I'm sure that I have, I didn't show you how I can cut aluminum and who knows what else is out there that I've never even thought of, would you let us know in the comments? Because there is a wealth of experience and practicality and wisdom in our community, and it is worth nothing if we don't share it. Thank you for watching Essential Craftsman, and keep up the good work.